Okay, so one of the things in my story, if my story is something that I'm going to share with people, would have to be about suicide. So while we're in this beautiful, soothing environment, can you see this? It's just like endless, beautiful mountains, water. It's a great time to get out some of the not so great things to talk about. I always say to my clients, before we can delve into any particularly uncomfortable or traumatic memories or physical experiences, we need to create a really safe, lovely space for you to be in, so that you know that you have the power to step back into that. Just as your thoughts may drift to something that's not very nice to think about, you need to build up a kind of image and sensations, engaging all your senses into something where you feel safe. So I feel quite safe here now, looking out at all of this. It's a lovely day. The sun isn't so bright, but it really doesn't matter. So suicide is something that in my family, that's been the thing. There's been a lot of mental illness, and the result of that has been suicide. So why the suicides happened? Who knows? Who knows what was the final thing that they happened? And they happened at different times in my life, and each one affected me quite differently. The first one actually wasn't directly impacting on me. It was my grandmother, and I'd actually never met her because I believe her mental illness had meant that neither my mother or father wanted me to meet her. So, but all I remember about her suicide is that she'd done it. I was about 8 years old. I remember hearing that she'd done it. I remember like these ornaments coming into our house, which apparently came from her home, and my dad was putting little price tags on it, and it was like this strange kind of sensation that these things belonged to someone who's dead now, and it was my dad's mum, and she killed herself. Anyway, so that was that one, and even though I wasn't affected by it in terms of knowing her, what I was affected by was the fact that within 2 or 3 years, my dad went completely off the rails. He started disappearing, just we wouldn't know where he was, and then he did suicide attempts himself. So when I was 10, 11 years old, I was profoundly impacted by my dad's suicidal tendencies, and this was a very, very difficult thing as a child to process, because actually at the time none of it was about me anyway. It was all about what my dad was doing, and my mum kind of running around after my dad. And so suicidal tendencies from my dad was a theme throughout my childhood. Anyway, by the time I was 16, actually my life was in quite a calm phase, but my granddad killed himself, and this was my father's father, and this was a big one for me. My parents had divorced a few years before. My dad had moved in with his new girlfriend, who became his wife, to live with my grandfather. And so for a couple of years, whenever I saw my dad, I was actually with my granddad, and he became almost like a main caregiver when I was there, because I'd share his bedroom, and he'd get me up, he'd give me toast and honey in the morning, he'd take me out when my dad was working, and I was really close to him. And also he was my last surviving grandparent. So when I was 16 and my granddad killed himself, it was devastating. It was, I immediately thought, what could I have done? I didn't spend enough time with him when I was going Christmas shopping, and I met him for lunch. Maybe if I'd stayed longer, then he'd have been okay. Maybe if I'd done this, maybe if I'd done that. I mean, for a 16-year-old to be feeling that responsible for, they could have had an effect on someone else being alive is a bit of a head fuck. So that was the beginning of really being kind of very damaged by the effect of someone else's suicide. And what made this worse, I believe, is that my dad was very dismissive. He said he didn't care about the fact his dad had killed himself, which didn't ring true, but that's how he was expressing his reaction to it. Other people around me were saying what a coward my granddad was for killing himself. I mean, all these different responses from different people, and people acting like, well, it happened, but they were okay about it. And I was just there, kind of unable to express anything, just kind of in complete shock and grief, and having nowhere to go with it. And I have to say that that is when I started using drugs, because I didn't know how to cope. And years later, I actually read a leaflet by the NHS talking about how to help a teenager deal with suicide, and whereas people around me were saying, no, just back to school, get on with it. Actually, what I read later on was don't push them back into their education. Don't tell them they just need to get on with it. Give them a notepad and tell them to write down what they feel. Get them support, get them this, get them that. So not only was there a suicide, but it was actually dealt with very badly in terms of how I could process it at the time. So then the third suicide was the one that really knocked me flying, and that was the suicide of my dad. And that happened when I was 25. And it's perhaps a whole story within itself, but I've spent 22 years processing the fact that my dad killed himself, because there's so many different aspects of it. There's the fact that I don't have a dad anymore. There's the fact that I get triggered by other people having dads. There's the fact that I wasn't happy in my life right around the time my dad killed himself, and without going into details, I could create a very convincing story of being partly responsible because of the timing, that it was kind of my fault, which of course we know in a logical brain it's not, but the body holds a whole different version of what's going on. My dad had a history of mental illness, and suicide had forever been part of this. When he was finally found that he had finally done it, he did it with drugs and alcohol. Actually, they all did it with drugs and alcohol. Because of this, I have such a dislike for alcohol, because it will never be a positive thing for me, because it's been abused so badly. But when you've dealt with that many suicides, you become someone, in my experience, and who's fearful they could do it themselves. I mean, you know, some families they have cancer, some families they have heart disease. In my family we did suicide. It's never something I've tried, it's never something I want to try. You know, I sometimes have a joke with people that if I make it to the cemetery, just put on my gravestone, she made it, and it wasn't a DIY job. Because, you know, every day is a special day when you consider that if you did it yourself, you could kill yourself at any time. And yeah, obviously a healthy person is never going to want to kill themselves. You know, they're going to want to go on lovely trips like this and see beautiful views. And maybe for me that is why I love traveling. I mean, I know after my dad's suicide, that was it. I traveled around the world for about 2 years after his death, because I needed to get out there and value the world that I lived in, and I needed to get out there and see different things rather than just have the trauma that was going on in my head. Suicide is without a doubt pretty much one of the most traumatic, shocking versions of dealing with someone's death that you can hope to come up against. Even a client said to me he worked with a charity that supported families who'd lost close members of the family through suicide or murder. And he said to me that actually for anyone dealing with a suicide, it's a lot harder than murder, because with suicide you get stuck in this grief of self-blame, or I could have done something to change it, I could have done something to, what if. It's an endless cycle of what if. I'm starting 22 years later to step out of that, but it does take time. It does take time to not wish things were different, to not kind of think, what if I'd done this, what if I'd done that. I always take myself away every year on the anniversary of my dad's suicide. I've learned the best way to deal with it is self-care and self-love, and doing something really, really nice for myself. Travelling is always something that I love, seeing new places and remembering what a beautiful world we live in. So that if potentially through those few days around the anniversary I feel quite dark and quite disturbed, it's good to balance it out with something that's light and beautiful. So there are different aspects of dealing with suicide, different ways of processing it, and of course different things work for different people. I know in my family everyone had a different way of dealing with it. One would like to think that an event that could bring some, people closer together, that it would do that, but very often it just splinters other relationships around the person who died. So all of this comes back to the subject of trauma and different aspects of, things that we need to process, and that if we don't process, they stay stuck in us. And if stuff stays stuck in us, it's painful. And if it's painful, we will try and find ways to suppress the pain unless we can express it and process it. So within eggshell therapies over the years, it's been very much, addressing how do we process it. And it is possible, and different things work for different people at different times. There is no one glove fits all ever, because we are all different. And what works for me this year might not have worked for me last year or next year. And so it really is about tuning in to what do you need right now to keep you well, so that, for me, so that I would never get to that place, which historically in my family people have. And I like to think of myself, and it's something that I've been told a lot, as someone who's a pattern breaker, who's turned focusing on or doing self-destructive things to doing self-loving things. However, it's not always like that. There are good days, there are bad days, and I will always need to keep an eye on myself and the environments I'm in and the people I'm around, and nurture myself and listen for the signs of anything that could be an indication of me having something I need to resolve, because I never want to end up doing a DIY job, so to speak. So that's one aspect of my story. I'm sure I can share about it again, and also I think there have been different things that I found over the years that have helped, and I think I will try and maybe do some interviews with different organisations about different things that have helped, and different expertise that you can bring in, methods you can use. to help you process something that's very, very traumatic like that, to get it out of your system so it doesn't need to affect the rest of your life.